In July of 2014, hundreds of Jews praying for peace in the Middle East were trapped inside a Paris synagogue. The mob outside, a group of Gaza demonstrators, lobbed bottles and bricks at the facility and shouted death to the Jews and Hitler was right, Hitler for president, was the refrain days later as Gaza protesters rampaged through Sarcelis, a Paris suburb, torching cars and Jewish businesses. There is, too, the equally insidious embrace of Holocaust denial. Fore is right. Gas chambers are BS, so proclaimed many of the 17,000 protesters who marched through Paris on last January's Day of Anger. Robert Fore is a French academic whose so-called scholarship includes statements such as, never did Hitler order or permit the killing of a person because of her race or religion. Who should worry French Jews more? Those who deny the first Holocaust or those who call for the second? The problem is not restricted to France, writes Tuttle. In Germany, arsonists threw Molotov cocktails at the Bersic synagogue, setting it ablaze for the second time in a century. The first was 1938, when it was burned to the ground during Kristallnacht. Also in July, Gaza protesters stormed the streets of Berlin shouting, "Gas the Jews." In May, 4 people were gunned down outside the Jewish Museum of Belgium in Brussels. 2 months later, a Belgian doctor refused to treat a Jewish woman who had fractured a rib, telling her son, send her to Gaza for a few hours, then she'll get rid of her pain. Similar events have been reported in Sweden. Ask Jews there, if you can find one. In 2012, a Jewish community center was bombed, and now the sole remaining Jewish kindergarten boasts swastikas, messages such as, Anne Frank was a liar, and Jews, your end is near, have recently appeared on the walls and windows of Jewish businesses near Rome's main synagogue. In Austria, Gaza protesters rushed the field and attacked a visiting Israeli soccer club in July. Hungary's neo-Nazi Jobbik Party won 20% of the vote in the country's general election in April, while supporters of Greece's Golden Dawn Party gathered outside the country's parliament in June and sang the Nazi anthem. Jewish Europeans cannot help but notice. In 2013, the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights polled Jews in 8 EU member states about their experiences and perceptions of anti-Semitism. Of the nearly 6,000 respondents, 66% believed anti-Semitism is a problem where they live. 76% say it has worsened in the past 5 years. 46% worry about becoming victims of harassment. 1/3 worry about becoming victims of violence. And nearly 1 in 4 avoid Jewish events or sites for reasons of safety. And the result is a new exodus. In the words of the famous Jewish Soviet dissident Natan Sharansky, the beginning and the end of European Jewry. In 2013, France surpassed the United States, become the world's second largest source behind Russia of Jews emigrating to Israel, just under 3,300. That was a 72% increase from 2012. Israeli officials expect to absorb another 5,000 French Jews in 2014. Of course, it turned out to be 7,000. A 2014 poll by the Paris-based Synia, an organization of Sephardic French Jews, showed that 74% of Jews in France at the time had considered emigrating because of perceived anti-Semitism. According to the EU poll I just cited, 48% of Hungarian Jews, 40% of Belgian Jews considered it too. And those numbers have no doubt ticked up in recent months. The causes of these trends, religious hatred, rising nationalist fervor, and antipathy toward Israel, are several, but they're beginning to converge. Across Europe's borders in recent years have flooded millions upon millions of immigrants, the overwhelming majority from North Africa and the Middle East. So the demographic makeup of Europe is changing rapidly. France may be home to Europe's largest Jewish population, 500,000, but it is also home to its largest population of Muslims, some 5 million, just under 10% of the country's total population. 4 million Muslims reside in Germany. In Belgium, Muslims constitute 6% of the population, but 25% in Brussels. As of 2011, 1 in 10 citizens in Malmö hailed from North Africa or the Middle East. And because of migration and birth rates, all of those numbers are projected to rise. In other words, the protesters coming out in hundreds and thousands to show support for Gaza, often by smashing a Jewish storefront or two, rarely trace their bloodlines back to France of the Charles de Gaulle era, let alone to the Bourbons. The anti-Semitic prejudices that are now not uncommon in the streets of Europe have religious or cultural roots that until recently were rare on Europe's shores. Which is not to deny that Europe has experienced centuries of anti-Semitism, but the causes have traditionally been different. Gee, I wonder what it is. Of note is the way in which the new anti-Semitism of Europe's immigrants and the old-fashioned anti-Semitism of radical parties are converging. In France's Day of Anger protest, demonstrators also chanted, "Jew, get out, France is not for you," thus laying claim to the national identity of a country to which the immigrant population among them is very new. Meanwhile, last November, the Jobbik Party chairman, Jabor Vona, on a visit to Turkey, declared that, quote, "Islam is the last hope for humanity in the darkness of globalism and liberalism." Muslims are often anathema to nationalist organizations, the English Defense League, for example, so the merger of the two is telling. If jackboots and yellow stars are passé, anti-Semitism can be adapted to the needs of the times. And then, of course, there's Israel. Certainly there are opponents of the State of Israel who are not anti-Semitic, but they're increasingly difficult to find. The tendency of anti-Israel demonstrations throughout Europe to degenerate into mob violence against local Jews suggests that few distinguish any longer between the Jewish state and Jews as such. Even the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, to which a number of American and European businesses, universities, and other organizations have subscribed, often serves only as a socially acceptable veil for anti-Semitic attitudes. Supporters of the movement not infrequently compare Israel's treatment of Palestinians to South African apartheid or even Nazi pogroms. But the interpenetration of religious and national identity that characterizes Israel, what makes it unique. Few are the critics who lobby for Palestinian repatriation and support Israel's self-determination as an explicitly Jewish state. And it goes on. And my point of bringing this to you, most of you in my audience are not Jewish. Many are, but most are not. As I brought to you my comments about the targeting and slaughter of Christians throughout the world, and the targeting and slaughtering of, yes, Muslims. What's happening in Europe now is something to fear greatly. And the fact that these governments and these so-called leaders are so incapable of responding to this danger is what's going to make it worse. Must we wait for Churchill? I fear we must.